Hey everyone, it's Neon Polygons. Happy New Year. And today I want to give you guys a quick look at my custom built bartop arcade machine. Now I had this bartop arcade machine built for me in 2014, and today is January 1, 2020. And I will say, even almost 6 years later, this machine holds up incredibly well. The reason behind that is because this bar top arcade machine was actually built with a micro ATX PC inside, as opposed to going with your typical Raspberry Pi slash Pandora's box that most bar top builders generally like to do. I also had this machine in terms of like the actual like bar top kit itself. It's not your typical MDF wood. You'll notice here, and it's really kind of hard to tell in this lighting, but the actual panel itself is much more of a acrylic plastic as opposed to MDF. And to me, that personally just makes it like just look a lot nicer, and B also just it just feels better when playing. The smoothness of the actual panel as opposed to kind of having like a glass plexi here to cover your control buttons and whatnot. It's just a lot more of a smoother feeling, and it also just like lasts longer because for the most part, usually MDF wood, unless you put glass pixels or a pixel glass over here, they generally tend to rub off, and in this case, it won't do that. So a little bit of background and history on this machine. The reason I had it built out was essentially it my sister actually passed away, or my youngest sister actually passed away in 2013. And so she kind of introduced me to video games. She was really the first one in my household to actually have a video game console. In fact, my first video game console was a Sega Master System, which was a pass me down from her. And my next video game console, which was a Game Boy, was also a pass me down from her as well. So she really was the person that introduced me to video games. And in all honesty, if probably not for her, I probably would not have had video games at such a young age and had been introduced to like kind of all the wonders and being fascinated with the technology of video games. So after she passed away, I was looking for to do something kind of in dedication to her, and so I had this basically built out. And one of the things you'll see here is on the marquee, it's in Japanese. So it stands for arcade in Japanese. And I actually designed this marquee myself. And while it may not seem like a lot, what I did in the background, as you'll see when I turn it on, is there's a number of video game companies that I love that when you turn it on, they actually just pop in you know, pop in vibrance when lit up. Now, another thing that kind of just keep in mind is this is as simple as it looks. This is actually an original design by me. And it's funny because when I actually had this printed out, the person who was building out the bar top arcade machine, I guess he just might have miscommunicated or had some miscommunication and assumed that I was okay with allowing him to use this design for other people. Uh, which I wasn't, but he actually ended up putting on his site, and if you actually want to have this design, you can. Now, I will say there is one minor flaw that I will tell you that why you shouldn't, and not really a flaw, but essentially on this marquee is a small, very small kanji inscript that I wrote in there that is basically in dedication to my sister. So, long story short, there, if you know where to look and you start to see a little bit of Japanese hiragana, basically it's saying in dedication to my sister. And I guess that'd be kind of weird if you also got this marquee design as well, and you're probably thinking that, oh, it looks cool, but what you don't realize is it's actually a memorial to someone that passed away. So long story short, if you want to know the origin of this marquee design, it is me. So I had this machine built out again 6 years ago, and essentially a year after my sister passed away, or in the period after my sister passed away. And when I actually had this design, I also was like thinking that, listen, this is going to be for the long term and for the long haul. And when you look at the machine, it's very simple looking. You'll notice that I like to keep it all white, minimalist of a look. And I didn't put any of like those decals or stickers or anything kind of tacky. In fact, that's one of the reasons I want the marquee to kind of just look almost like very vanilla and not too anything too over the top. You know, like a lot of people generally tend to have like marquee designs with like these kind of pixel characters or, you know, old school video game characters. And to me, it just wasn't my cup of tea. I just felt that was a little bit too tacky. And so I wanted to have a very minimalist marquee design and not very much on the machine itself. In fact, the only decals you'll see here are these two Sonic kind of stickers that are really just to kind of like accent the bumper buttons on the machine. And the reasoning behind that is because, you know, I'm an adult, and so a machine like this, which, you know, approximately costs about, I'd say, over $3,000 to build out, you know, you don't want it to look like a toy. You want it to look kind of like fancy schmancy, sophisticated, and high tech, right? So the best way to kind of do that is to just have it have it just be a minimalist look. And so I kept it very, very simple, very clean looking. And I wanted to do it this way because no matter where I would live, no matter where I would move to, it would match the aesthetic of the rest of the space. And so it's just one of those things to keep in mind if you're going to build a bar top arcade machine and you're building it for the long haul and you kind of want to, you know, grow with you and mature with you, the best thing to do is just kind of keep the look very simple and clean. Again, like just imagine that you're a person in your late 20s or 30s or 40s and someone comes into your household and then they just see something like all bright and colorful and with tacky designs on it. You know, it's going to look kind of childish, kind of immature. It will just look like a big expensive toy as opposed to a big expensive piece of technology, which is probably what's more preferable from a maturity standpoint and, you know, just from an overall aesthetic. That's just my personal opinion on it. And you know, that's why I had this machine kind of just done in a very minimalist look. So I guess that's it for really the aesthetics. My whole point was I just wanted to keep it nice and clean and simple and then just really kind of highlight the things that, you know, were meaningful on the machine, which was kind of Japanese because, you know, I love Japanese culture. The small inscription in hiragana, that was a dedication to my sister. A very clean, simplistic look, and the lone Sega decal, just because I was introduced to Sega by my sister, and long story short, I'm just basically a big fan of Sega. So this is the machine. It all runs on, as I said, on a micro ATX PC. It uses an iPac encoder for the controls, and for the most part, it's, I would say, one of the best builds that I could have possibly imagined. The person who helped me kind of, I guess, got this built out, while it's parts from 2011, 2012, they were maxed out, and it's done in a way where everything is optimized. Like all the emulators were optimized to run on these parts. So a good example of that is like, well, today, you know, the Sega Saturn emulation is kind of still in its, you know, iffy stages. On this machine, the Sega Saturn emulator, I think it's called MDen, whatever it's called, it runs exceptionally well. And I was 2014 when I first got this machine, I was quite amazed at how well it ran. So, you know, like enough talk. Let's actually turn on the machine so you guys can see it in action. As you can see there's all the game companies that light up when the machine turns on. And let's see. For the front end of the system, it uses Hyperspin. And as you'll see here, the reason I love it is because to me, it's much more of a better graphical interface as opposed to, I would say, a Pandora's Box or Raspberry Pi, which generally are very text heavy, as I best put it. And the way how I wanted this machine to be set up was I could just essentially leave it on all day, and you could just get a good visual of what games you want to play just by these small video previews that you'll see here. So it kind of has like a nice like jukebox look to the interface, which in my opinion is much more welcoming and appealing to someone, a guest who would come over and is not really like a big fan of video games or doesn't really know video game, libraries that well. They would see like, oh, check it out, like this is an emulator for old school games, or they'll scroll down and say, okay, like this is the Atari emulator, this is the an emulator for like arcade games. And so it's very kind of easy to understand for someone who would be coming over to your household and just doesn't know video games. And it's a very easy kind of system to kind of just figure out like, okay, these are the types of games that would be per emulator. And then once you choose the emulator, you could see a preview of the game itself. So to me, Hyperspin is the preferred choice for kind of going with a front end. Even 6 years later after I got this machine, I still think, even compared to like the new interfaces from Pandora's Box and Raspberry Pi, Hyperspin is still the way to go. So there's about 70,000, I guess, games loaded onto this. Some work great, some work, not so great. But for the most part, most of the games that I played via MAME are pretty much flawless. And I'll show you some examples where I guess like it's kind of iffy. Maybe the one emulator here that is where this machine really struggles on, which I'm still kind of baffled as to why, is the Atari Jaguar, and in some cases the 3DO. I think part of it has to do kind of just with the resolution of the Jaguar and just like its use of sprites, that it just somewhat causes some issues for emulation. And so I'm not quite sure if it's the machine, the emulator, or a combination of everything, but the Jaguar doesn't really, the Atari Jaguar emulator and the 3DO emulators don't quite really work as great as I was hoping them to be. But for the most part, most of the other emulators, even consoles that are way more advanced than the Atari Jaguar, work just fine. In fact, the Dolphin emulator I have here, which runs GameCube and Wii games, I mean, it works just as well as using a GameCube and Wii now, and it does it in high definition. There's an M3 emulator and an M2 emulator, which I'll get into in a bit, which are basically Sega arcade games from the late 90s, early 2000s, and it works like exceptionally well. So there is like a few things that just kind of baffle me on the machine as to why they don't run so great, but for the most part, the machine like handles most emulators, just fine, perfectly, if at that. So I guess like kind of the other things just to keep in mind when I had this machine kind of built out was I wanted something that I could just pick up and play at any time I wanted. And so one of the other big reasons that it's great to kind of have like an all-in-one emulator machine is we're getting to the point right now where game libraries are becoming digitized, but a lot of games essentially are being lost in history. And it's the reason behind that is because a lot of game publishers from the late 90s, or from the I say pre 2005, a lot of game publishers have essentially kind of just went out of business, and a lot of their IPs are somewhat just lost to the legal world in the sense where no one really quite knows how to handle or navigate a lot of like the ownership of those property rights anymore at this point. And so you have a lot of like hidden gems that are basically lost. And there's a lot of people out there who are doing, as much as they can for game preservation, and they upload those ROMs and ISOs, and thus really the only way to kind of play them now is either having the original hardware, which may be very expensive, or by just emulation. And so I want to have a machine that essentially had every game I could possibly imagine all in one setup. So this time, I don't always have to like find a way to, find my Atari Jaguar or find my Sega Dreamcast and plug them all in and find the game and do this, and that. And if I just want to play something for just a short burst, all I have to do is just turn on this machine and, go to the right emulator and play the game. So part of, I guess, the allure of having kind of a cool bar top arcade with, loaded with emulators is basically for ease of use and, especially in today's world where everything is kind of like pick up and play, it's a great way to, first get a good feel for a game. And then, if you like, then I guess if the game is like that great, then you can go out there and actually purchase the original software and slash hardware. So let's take a look at some of the emulators that are on this machine to give you an idea of like what I'm playing and what, some suggestions for you guys to get when you're building out your bar top arcade. And I'm actually keeping the volume off right now, just because it's quite loud. In fact, I'll give you an example. Every time I do an action, there's kind of like a sound effect. Now I don't mind it, but obviously as I'm doing a YouTube video, it's probably going to be really annoying. So for the time being, I'm just going to keep this volume down. But I will say this though: the speakers, when you take a look at inside the machine, everything that's being used in here, from the Intel processor to the Asus Micro ATX motherboard to the RAM, they're pretty quality parts. The parts where you can kind of cheap out on are essentially, let's say, like the speakers and the amplifier over here, which you can probably just find on eBay literally for like about $20 total. And the reason being is because, generally speaking, they'll sound great. You don't need to have, from a system coming out like this, you don't need like some super subwoofer, setup system. In fact, if you look at my other video that I just did for my arcade 1-up mod, I literally just use a cheap like $5 Bluetooth speaker for my sound, and it sounds just great, right? So if you're looking to kind of build these bar tops on your own, I'd say don't really cheap out on the actual parts to run the games, like such as like the motherboard and the processor. But you can shave some money off by just using kind of somewhat brand X parts that you can find on eBay for, the harnesses, the amplifier, the speakers, the LEDs. I mean, heck, I'd say even the buttons, like if you're willing to, you can probably just get even cheap on that. Now, for this machine, it uses like genuine Sanwa parts, so it's, and everything's in LED. So generally speaking, I didn't cheap out on those parts, but for everything else, such as the I guess like all the non-core parts and things that can be more generic, I chose like much more brand X parts to supplement the machine. So, okay, so let's take a look at some of the emulators that we got on here. All the old school kind of stuff is on here, such as like the Fairvision, the ColecoVision, CreatorVision. I got some Laserdisc games, such as this is what the Daphne emulator's for running games like Dragon's Lair and Space Odyssey. The Dice emulator is for like those really early 60s arcade games, such as like Pong and I guess really whatever this game is called over there that you're looking at right now. It has a separate emulator for the Famicom Disk System. I've never really tried it out, to be honest with you. This is a pretty cool emulator. This is the STV. So basically, this was the arcade version of the Sega Saturn, or essentially arcadeware in which it would make easy game translations for the Sega Saturn. So there's a number of really great games in this emulator, such as Batman Forever, Die Hard Arcade, Virtua Fighter Kids. So basically, if you want to play like the original versions of where they were converted from, this is a great emulator for that. There is a pinball emulator on this machine, hence like the need for the two bumper buttons. It's pretty cool. There's a few games that I have here that are of classic pinball games that most pinball fanatics would know, such as like Abracadabra or Adam's Family, Metallica, etc. So there's some really cool things in here. So the handheld emulators all like work really great on this, but unfortunately, the one flaw I guess I would say is the again. Remember these pixels. It goes to with the Game Boy Advance as well. Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Gear, etc. Links. Just remember the original resolution of these games are probably like less than like 200 pixels, I'd say, or 200, whatever it could be. And, you're blowing that up to a 1080p screen, and it doesn't look as pretty is the best way to put it. So, while you can play handheld games on this, and literally every Game Boy ROM is on this machine, every GBA ROM is on this machine, to me, it personally is just not the best experience just because, well, it kind of just like looks fugly. So you can, I guess, use these emulators to get an idea of how the game runs and the experience. But for the most part, I wouldn't suggest using a bar top to play like handheld emulation. The Vectrix is really great on this. Now, I actually have a Vectrix in real life, and so it is really hard to emulate those vector graphics feeling of kind of vibrancy and just luminosity. So it does a really great job of just showing you what a Vectrix game, what it plays like, what it looks like. But in terms of like trying to replicate that vector graphic, vibrance, I will say that it is a tough stretch coming on an LCD screen. Okay, so this is a GX 4000. So I've never really played this emulator. I've tried it. I've also played a real Armstrad, and they're typically slow to begin with, and the emulation also runs it slow. So I thought at first like maybe it was like bad emulation. No, it's actually perfect emulation of a slow system. Got in television. So this is kind of cool. So I actually have a number of MP3s kind of just uploaded into this machine. So if I didn't actually want to use this as a kind of, an arcade machine, I can actually just like turn this on and just leave it as a jukebox and just leave it on at a party. So it's pretty cool that this machine has like kind of a double functionality where it's not just like an arcade machine, it can also work as like a sound system. And again, like, while it's not the greatest speakers on this machine, it sounds great in my opinion, and it's a pretty like kind of cool little thing to kind of show people that, hey, I semi got like a jukebox type of device in my household. And so I would suggest if you do make a bar top arcade machine, I would also suggest that adding a jukebox to it, it would actually kind of accent it really nice and add a little bit more functionality to the machine. All right, so let's get to the meat of it. And the meat of like really this bar top arcade machine is MAME. And so on here, I would say is the majority of most of the games that I want to play was via MAME emulator. So we're talking everything here from like really hidden gems from like the 70s and 80s to more modern games up until the 2000s, like such as stuff from SNK and Capcom, stuff that was kind of like built for, I guess, like higher end 2D games for 3D systems at the time. And that's a little bit hard to explain, but think more like Street Fighter 2 Anniversary Edition, which was kind of like a redrawn version of Street Fighter that was put out on the Xbox 360. This runs it like actually really well. And like just think about like all the classic beat 'em ups from like the 90s, such as like X-Men and Turtles in Time and Final Fight. That's all in here. And we'll go into MAME in a second. So Neo Geo and Neo Geo CD and the Neo Geo AES, they all work fine. It's essentially every ROM, CD, and ISO that was made for the Neo Geo. It's all in here, works great. Neo Geo Pocket, same thing. The entire catalog's in here, and as same thing with the Game Boy and Game Gear emulators. I wouldn't, really recommend running kind of handheld emulation through the system. through this setup. The resolution just, I guess, is just not going to be good. In fact, it will look like that. It will look, just like that, but even more zoomed in. Just, super pixelated and just not like a really pretty picture. N64 works great on this machine. Unfortunately, the controls. So I've had issues where, unfortunately, like these joysticks, they are mapped to the D-pad of the N64, not the analog stick. And so because of that, essentially, you're kind of limited in the number of games that you can actually run. So while it runs the games really well from a control setup, this isn't really ideal. And so it's just one of those things to keep in mind that if the game has like two like analog sticks, or just analog in general, a lot of the 3D emulation on this is going to be difficult to play from just a control standpoint. It runs them quite well. The machine runs it quite well. In fact, running on 2011 hardware runs it like exceptionally well, but controls are just not ideal. Okay, so all the Nintendo games, the Nintendo arcade system is all here. Everything from the NES is all in here. Game Boy Color is kind of the same thing I just spoke about from handheld emulation. GameCube runs exceptionally well. Now it's showing GameCube and it's using the Dolphin emulator, but in reality I can also run Wii games on this and it runs it in high definition. That also is a big stretch for me to play. There are only like a finite number of games that I can kind of get to work properly because of the control setup, but otherwise most games will generally work just fine and run both GameCube and Wii games in 1080p. So it's an amazing upscale emulation, or resolution upscaling through the Dolphin emulator. Okay, so 3DO, I kind of discussed like the issues that I had before. This is the PC engine, so TurboGrafx 16, and then there's also TurboGrafx 16 emulator itself for American Pacific only games. I do have a bunch of movies that are actually loaded into this. Now, this to me wasn't really necessary, but in case I just want to watch a movie on the fly that, now that really doesn't make sense because we have like Netflix and whatnot. But I do have, I can get movies uploaded to this, and there is an HDMI out on this machine that I can actually play it on my television. So if I am so inclined, I can actually watch movies. Here are some puzzle PC games that are just like, playable on this machine. Okay, so here comes the Sega emulators. 32X runs great, Sega CD runs great, Dreamcast runs great. Again, there's just some issues with controls because it uses an analog stick. Game Gear, as I mentioned, handheld emulation is struggling. I do have the entire Sega Genesis catalog. Now, if I want to add some of those homebrew games that have been made in recent years, they actually work just as fine on this emulator as well, so no problem there. Sega Master System complete catalog, including a lot of the stuff that was released in like Brazil. So that's great. Now here are kind of my two favorite emulators. It's the M2 and M3. Basically, these are the arcade hits from Sega in the late 90s, early 2000s. M2 being more known for like Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and Daytona USA, whereas M3 is known more so for Star Wars, the arcade game, and Virtua Fighter 3. All of them work like great on this machine, and I would say probably again, like now this is like I'm using hardware from 8 years ago. By the time you guys are doing this, and you can probably find cheaper parts, they'll probably run even better on a setup that you guys would do. Okay, so it also runs Naomi, so it's basically much more, I guess, of the consoleized version of, the arcade version of the Dreamcast as opposed to the M3 emulator. This runs it really well. Games on this include like Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I believe Mars Matrix is also on this one. So a number of great games that run just really great via the Sega arcade emulators. Here's the Sega Saturn emulator. I have the entire Sega Saturn library on this bad boy. Most of the games I played run at like perfect emulation. So Sega 1000, some shotgun games. Now with the shotgun games, I actually have to use a mouse to play them, so it's not as fun. But they do work. They do work. PlayStation emulation is amazing on this machine. I kind of would compare it to kind of how Bleemcast on Dreamcast worked, where you can actually play PlayStation games on a Dreamcast and have them like actually upscale in resolution and smooth out the jagged edges. This actually kind of does almost the same thing. So I have to complete PlayStation ISO set that's like on this machine. And I should just kind of mention, essentially, this machine uses like a 4 terabyte hard drive. So, you know, it's stacked with with a bunch of games. I don't have as many PlayStation 2 games on this, but the games that I do have, they run exceptionally well. So stuff like Final Fantasy X, Tomb Raider, Metal Gear Solid, 2 and 3, Resident Evil 4, actually, they all work just fine on this machine. And so this also came at a time when, I got this machine that PlayStation 2 emulation was still not perfect. So I'm sure by now a lot has changed, and you can probably get like near perfect emulation on most PS2 games at this point. Super Nintendo games are all in there. Super graphic games are all in there. I think like 6 of them. Now the Taito Type X is kind of a arcade board emulation, so kind of an example of this would be Street Fighter 4. Would be kind of like the main kind of like emulator on this. Try to figure out some other ones I got here. TurboGrafx 16, Virtual Boy, especially all the rare Virtual Boy games. Wonder Swan, and Zinc, which Zinc is pretty much kind of like an arcade emulator from the mid-90s. I guess the more notable ones are probably like Tekken and or Tekken 2, Tekken 3, and I'm trying to think of like what another big marquee game would be on the Zinc. Probably like Strider 2. I think Capcom was running it on this arcade hardware. Okay, so let's go to see what we got. So let's go into... Also, here's a really cool emulator, just really side note, is the CPS2. So that's where all your big Street Fighter 2D games. And the CPS3, which is one of my favorite emulators. Essentially what you'll find on this is like the heavy animation games that Capcom was doing in the late 90s, such as Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And one of the rare arcade games, Red Earth. So they run just fine on this machine. Okay, so let's go into MAME so I can just show you kind of an example of some of the games that we got in here. And like I said, MAME is the majority of most of these games. So again, like you'll find a lot of like the cool scales. How do I best put this? Sprite scaling arcade games from the 80s and 90s, most notably the ones that Sega made, such as like AB Cop. And not until recently, most of these games didn't emulate well, but on this machine, hell yeah, it just runs like butter, man. So let's see, like I have this essentially like A through Z, 0 through 100, whatever, is the way how like Hyperspin essentially like organizes the games. And what's really great is like if I just do nothing and I just leave it on standby mode, it will just kind of go through a random assortment of games and then kind of just show you a preview. So even if you just didn't want to even play this arcade or bartop arcade machine, you could just pretty much just let it just go on autoplay, and it just, I don't know, for me it kind of almost like keeps me entertained, just seeing like game after game of, oh, what's this? Oh, what's that? Another game that I haven't figured out or never knew about. And so every day I kind of turn on this machine, I kind of discover a new game every time. And I think that's kind of, the joy of having kind of a super emulator bar top, is that it's what will you discover next, right? And, I'm lucky to have had all 70,000 games already uploaded, and at the same time kind of have their controls all mapped out. I think that is probably one of the tougher things in terms of, setting up your own bar top, is the fact that, you have to like set up all the controls, and it's such a clunky process. I literally will have to, what I did was on MAME, I basically set the universal keyboard setup for like all games to basically just use these two as like your main 2 buttons. And most arcade games generally don't have a lot of buttons, except for, fighting games, which basically use like everything. So when I do come across a game where the controls are not just like really perfectly set up, I'll like kind of tinker that and, you know, modify just for that game. But for the most part, most games I had set up so it only uses these two as the action buttons on both sides. So let's kind of just look through some kind of like really neat games in here. So you have all the Neo Geo arcade games that are also kind of loaded on the MAME emulator in addition to the Neo Geo AS emulator. In fact, pretty much a good portion of the main games, you can also find them in the other emulators as well. But it's just nice to kind of separate them into different systems. So if I just wanted to know a game that was on Super Nintendo, I could just go to my Super Nintendo emulator as opposed to going into MAME and having to find, you know, that whole, you know, go through like a gazillion letters just to find that game. And actually, like, the reason I just want to stop right now, like, I just noticed this game. I've never even heard of it, Osman, and it looks pretty cool, like a cool Strider clone. So I definitely want to kind of give that a look. And I'm surprised that I've missed that because I always go to Outrun, and this is actually a pretty cool game, Outrunners, which is basically a update or a sequel to Outrun. So yeah, so this is the machine. I'm trying to see if there's anything I can kind of look at right now. Power Drift. This is a pretty cool Sega game from Nice. You know, let's look at Power Drift and see how this bad boy runs. All right, I'll turn on the sound as well. And when I want to put in a coin, I have to hold this button, and that, once I do that, that gives me a credit. And then so let's. All right, so let's play a game. Now I'm playing this one-handed, so it's gonna kind of suck. As you can tell, frame rate looks great. You know, and really up until recently, I'd say like games like these, like, you know, these sprite scalers, they didn't emulate that well for some reason, even though we've had like more sophisticated hardware 20 years after the release. And so it's great that these old arcade gems from my childhood, I can now play them as I somewhat remembered them. Okay, so that's enough of that. So when I want to reset the machine or reset the game, I actually have to press this button and then press that button. So let's do that really quick. And that brings me back. So that's how I actually have to go back. And every time I go back, I first press this button, and then that button, and I reset emulators. Okay, so let's go to M3 to kind of close off this video. Told you it was noisy. Actually, let's look at M2. Show you a nice, cool, and let's choose a cool. You know what? Let's look at House of the Dead. House of the Dead, you know, has never really made it to a home console, and it never was ported perfectly to our home console. The Sega Saturn version was, you know, quite pixelated. So it's great to kind of see how House of the Dead, like a nice perfect emulation, would be set up. And so take a look. You can tell it looks great. I know there's a little bit of glare from my lamp over here, but it runs perfect. It looks just like I remember it from 20 years ago, so. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video, and, you know, if you made it this far, thanks for hearing my rambling on this bartop arcade machine. I kind of just want to leave you off with some closing notes, just to let you know that I do think, you know, as we start to become much more in a streaming world of video games, and by that I mean like something like a Netflix type platform, where it's like kind of all you can play, It would be great maybe to also just get a bartop arcade machine and set up your own super emulator system. Because again, like I said, there will be a lot of games that are lost to digital rights management and not digital rights management, but IP rights. And so really the only way to kind of play those games are through a means like this. And when it comes to kind of an all-you-can-play model like Netflix for video games, we're still a while away from that. I would say, generally speaking, if there is a platform like that where it is kind of all you can play, it will only be per brand when they launch. So think like only PlayStation games would only be playable via a certain service, and there will be only Nintendo games that will only be playable via a certain service. So it won't be like Netflix where it combines multiple studios into one platform, and you'll probably have to get multiple streaming services just to play, you know, Nintendo games and PlayStation games and Xbox games. And so that's what's great with having a bar top arcade machine and having everything just basically all in one machine. Anyways, guys, I'd love to know your opinion on this machine and any ways that I can further improve it. And I guess any feedback that you have, any criticisms or things that you loved about the machine, I'd love to know about it in the comments below. And if you loved this video, make sure to like and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And this is Neon Polygons, and wishing you a happy new year, and talk to you all soon.